Developing musicianship online.
Hello and welcome back to DM Online. Today I'm going to go into Graphic Equalisers, shortened to EQs. At this point in time, I think it's important to just look at the space in which you're actually doing your music making. I have studio monitors in my room, and a studio monitor is a very neutral speaker that is designed to not give bias to bass or treble and to keep things equal, so that as you're doing your graphic equalizing, you're not getting the speaker actually biasing anything that's going to confuse your mix. That is an optimum situation. Many of you perhaps only have access to headphones or your computer speakers. If that is the case, maybe this graphic equalizing is not ideal for you because you're going to perhaps wind up a bit disappointed with the results. Nonetheless, I'll go through the basics of what we do in graphic equalizing, and at the end of the day, if you want to go and buy yourself some nice neutral speakers, great. And if you want to keep mixing with your headphones, well, that's all up to you, I guess. So let's get into it. The whole purpose of graphic equalizing is to make your mix sound as balanced as possible and bring attention to what you want it to have attention to, rather than having a mixed up, muddled up collection of frequencies all competing for space and in the end making the mix sound muddy. So what we normally do is apply certain boosts to certain things and lots of cuts, so that we're not gaining volume, we're simply balancing the instrument in its little nest in the spectrum of frequencies. Okay, so when it comes to applying a graphic equalizer to a bass instrument or the kick drum, then we're going to get rid of all those high frequencies that we don't want getting in the way of other instruments. When we want to have a vocalist stand out at a mix, well, we're going to pull out the muddiness from the bottom and find that situation where they're boosting those frequencies that cut through and give them presence. So there's quite a lot to understand, and to be quite honest, GarageBand is not the best environment for understanding this, because you don't have the luxury of a mixing desk to really paint your musical picture with small adjustments here and there. But what I will do is I'll show you what is possible. So if we go over to the screen, first of all I'll show you just where to find this. So we're looking at the left hand top corner where the dial button is. If we click on the dial button, we get the track and master options down the bottom. Now master has an EQ option in it, and that will affect the entire mix. We would not do the master EQ until we're finished doing everything else. The track EQ is exactly the same layout, but will only affect that track. Now, if you were in a studio recording drums, you would separate the bass drum, the snare drum, the cymbals, the overheads. Everything would get their own track, and each track would actually be mixed differently, and then you bring together the sounds into one track. With Kyle, the automatic drummer, we don't have that option of the separate tracks. We just got the one track. Now, if you really wanted to fiddle around, you could duplicate what's there and actually pull out everything and just have kick, and then pull out everything and just have snare, and separate out Kyle into the different components. But you'd be here for a while, and we've got to assume that GarageBand put a bit of work into actually EQing the samples to start with, and we hope we've got a pretty clean drum sound. You can give your drum sound some boosts using the EQ. So let's just go to the settings that we have for Graphic Equalizer. We'll find them when you've got the EQ screen at the bottom. You'll find the EQ controls just come up next to the EQ sort of control console. If you're in the control section, you can actually bring that console up as a window by double clicking the channel EQ, and this will bring up exactly the same console. So if I just play this small section of drums, you're going to see, if I turn the analyzer on, where the different frequencies are popping out and where there's other ones that are much lower level. So this is just Kyle the drummer at the end of the song. Now, from just looking at the analysis of Kyle the drummer, we could see that there was, every time he hit the snare, the 200 Hertz frequency was popping up, and every time he hit the kick, between 50 and 100 Hertz popped up. So that's where they've actually mixed and EQ'd the kick and the snare to sit. Let's just have one more look at that. And you'll notice the toms actually popped up between 100 and 200 Hertz. So this is quite a low sounding drum kit, particularly the snare drum sound. There's not a lot of high frequency actually left in the snare, but you'll find the cymbals are all in the high frequencies. So as a mixer, if we wanted to use this graphic equalizer to emphasize certain things, we could at this point boost some of those frequencies to bring out those instruments more. For example, I could boost that 200 Hertz a little bit, and that's going to make the snare drum pop out a little bit more than the other things. And to the Q, when you've got this selected, the Q is the width of the band, so you can actually change and just make it really specific that you're only wanting that 200 Hertz to pop up. Let's have a listen to what happens when I boost my 200 Hertz. So there's now a much more hammering sound in the snare. It's really popping out. And we could do the same with cymbals and things like that. So the graphic equalizer is used to balance out our collection of instruments. If we dropped the Hertz in between 50 and 100, we would end up losing a lot of that kick drum. So again, I'm just going to pull it out. Now the kick drum was actually taking up a wide range of frequencies, so I'm just going to pull a lot of it out. Now we should end up with a mix that is really missing a lot of its kick drum. Now we wouldn't want that. That's not an optimum sound to go for, but it's just good to know how to control the sound quality of these instruments. So this one just deals with Kyle the drummer. Let's go on to an instrument that has more tonal information and see what happens there. I've come across to the bass player now. Let's have a look at what the spectrum analysis is when we put on the channel EQ. You'll see that the EQ itself has already had some adjustments made to it. This is part of pulling up the amplifier presets. So the computer will make some judgment calls on the EQ when you pull up an amplifier, but they are fully adjustable. So you'll see that there's absolutely nothing in the high register. Now normally what we would do is put in a shelf or a complete cut of anything that's in this high register, because we want to free up space for instruments that live in that space. And so we modify the sound to pull out anything that could possibly get in the way. Now we've seen the analyzer, and the analyzer is showing that there's really nothing in there. So it actually shouldn't have much of an implication on the sound itself. But it's a good practice to get into, to pull things out that are unnecessary use of frequency range. Let's have another listen. can hear that it's lost a little bit of its bite. I started chewing in a little bit too far, and that's where you start taking away from some of the clarity. The biggest problem with any EQing is when instruments are competing for space, and the kick drum and the bass guitar are always competing for space. So it's something where we've got to make some judgment calls on where you want the bass to sit. Now there are some ways we can manage this with compressors and things like that, but for the moment what we really want to do is be able to get the drums and the bass to play together and to sound good together without washing the bass of the kick drum out of the equation. So if I go back and I'll just make a further adjustment and have a look at the bass to see where it's competing with the kick drum. So remember, kick drum was predominantly between 50 and 100. So the bass is going to end up competing for that space if there's too much in the 50 to 100 range. So let's have a look at the analyzer again and look for that. So you can see the peak of the sound of bass is actually around 100 Hertz, which is a tiny bit higher than where the kick drum is sitting. It's almost halfway between the kick drum and the snare drum. What you'll find is there's a little bit of room there to give the bass a bit of a boost around the level that it can sit neatly between the kick drum and the snare drum. Let's see how that affects the sound. So now it's got more bite. Therefore, when I'm mixing everything else with it, it's not going to disappear into the mix. Now you may find you want to come back to your EQ at a later date. You may also find you've got multiple instruments you want to apply that EQ to, which is the case for me. I've got the same bass amp being used a couple of different places. So I'm going to save it as a definitive name so I can find it later. Gave it a number so it would appear at the top of my list. Now that it's saved, it means that when I go to substation 2, I can go to that channel EQ and pull up my new setting there. That way when I play back, now my EQ is going to be consistent across all basses. And I've got a third bass I also need to apply that to. So far we've only handled really drums and bass, and only in isolation. Next session I'll go into combining the sounds and starting to work up the whole mix and taking into consideration the various instruments that need to stand out and the other ones that need to duck into the mix a little bit more to get a good balance of the overall piece of music. So till next time, thanks for joining me. Bye bye.
DM, developing musicianship online.